Hi. In this mini lecture, we will review the main topics from Chapter 10 in the Hutchinson Human Dimensions Person and Environment textbook. We'll review the ways that family has been defined by social workers using 6 different theoretical perspectives. We'll also discuss diversity among and special challenges among families. There are different ways to define family. First, let's discuss the 4 main ways that social workers conceptualize family. I'll discuss how these definitions are informed by various theoretical perspectives later in this lecture. The first way of defining family is as a structure formed by legal relationships among its members. Some common legal relationships include marriage, parental rights of biological children, and adoption of children. The next way of defining family is as a household or residential unit. This definition refers to the people who live together. The census uses households as its unit of data collection and as a proxy for family. You'll note that this classification of families has its limitations, like all of these definitions do. They tend to leave out certain groups. The last 2 ways of defining family are rooted in the symbolic interaction theoretical perspective. The third way of defining family is using roles. In every family, people have different patterns of interacting and communicating based on their social roles. Some examples of social roles are as a spouse or a partner, parent, child, siblings, co-parents. Lastly, family can be defined as interaction. So in this definition, families are active creators of a common culture. So it is difficult to catalog all of the types of family structures, and it might even be impossible to do so because there is so much diversity. So, one question that you should be thinking as we go through these 6 different theoretical perspectives is how well does the theoretical perspective apply to different types of families? So, what are some of the examples of situations that create diversity in our family structures? This is a short list of some that are mentioned in your textbook. This is not an exclusive list. Substance abuse can affect family structure. We have increasing rates of children in foster care due to parental substance abuse, especially with the rise in opioid use and deaths. Another example is polyamory. Polyamory refers to um, relationships that are relationships where people agree that it's okay for everyone to be open or to have other romantic partners. Literally, the word polyamory means many loves. And this can create very different households and families. Particularly, you may find children who are being raised in families with more than 2 parents. Also, LGBTQ in the community, there are special issues for parenting, and for creating families. And lastly, your book talks about military families and the stressors that they face with separations and deployments. So, on these next few slides, and for the remainder of this micro lecture, we will touch on each of the 6 theoretical perspectives that are used to understand families. First, we will talk about the family systems perspective. This is the most commonly used perspective by social workers to understand families. And it has its roots in 2 different perspectives, in the psychodynamic or relational perspective, and also in the ecological social systems perspective. The psychodynamic perspective focuses on the relationships between members of a family. So within the family unit, the relationships between family members. In the ecological social systems perspective, we are focused on the relationships of the family and family members with outside systems. So these 2 different perspectives have different ideas about problems of living and human behavior. The psychodynamic or relational approach uses genograms. Genograms are tools that help social workers to map out the family structure and family history of a client. It helps you to learn more about the relationships that people within your client's family have with one another. And this approach posits that most problems are due to unresolved problems in the family of origin. Family of origin is the family that a person is raised in. A concept that's important to the relational perspective is differentiation of self, which was founded by Bowen, who is a famous family systems theorist. And he specifies that to differentiate yourself, you have to both be able to do that between yourself and your members of your family, and then also between thinking and feeling. A tool similar to a genogram that is also used by social workers is called a family eco map. The difference is that the family eco map plots the interactions that a family has with outside systems like a church or places of work, and even bigger systems like politics and education. The next theory we'll discuss is the exchange and choice perspective. There are generally 4 assumptions about exchange and choice: that humans act out of self-interest, that they make choices about relationships, and that those choices are rational, and that social relationships are characterized by interdependence and reciprocity. So, based on those assumptions, social scientists have looked at relationships, specifically about rewards and cost of relationships and commitment. Some types of commitment that have come out of that research are moral commitment, personal commitment, and structural commitment. So researchers have found that there are various dimensions of commitment. Not only your personal benefit or interest in being in the relationship, but also your values. So, what's important to you morally. And then structural commitment is more about practicalities. So, an example that may come up is when families decide, or spouses decide to get a divorce whenever their children move out of the house and go to college. They may have been unhappy for a long time, but wanted to stay together for their children to create stability. And then once they were out of the house, that's no longer there. So that's an example of a structural or practical reason. The biggest criticism of the exchange and choice theory is that it ignores altruistic behavior. However, other theorists say that it still accounts for this through focusing on moral values. However, there certainly are limitations in this approach, and we could argue that humans are not always rational in their choices. Symbolic interaction. You might remember from the earlier slide that two of our ways of defining family come from this approach. Specifically, roles are very important, and symbols. So, symbols are what families use to create memories out of their experiences together and eventually accumulate to form a culture for the family along with its rituals and roles. Feminist approach is rooted essentially in the conflict perspective, and it argues that family shouldn't be studied as a whole because there are patterns within families that are prejudiced against women, and there are family practices that give more advantage to men over women. There are other diversity factors as well that can create advantages for some members over others. One example is children. So, children usually have less advantages over adults in families. Your book makes an important point that family can be a site of both love and trauma. So, the feminist perspective recognizes that family can have lots of benefits for a person, and it also can be a source of loss and grief and trauma. The intersectional feminist theory will come up again and again in your social work coursework. This theory posits that women are constantly having to think about how their gender affects their lives, but also their gender intersects with other diverse factors of their identity. So, for example, a disabled woman would have the intersection of being a woman and being disabled. And that interaction makes their experience a completely different experience than just a woman without a disability or a man with a disability. The life course or developmental perspective is also a popular approach to understanding families, and we think of cohorts as groups of people who are around the same age and grow up in the same historical era. And so historical events and cultural factors affect those cohorts differently than people who were born in other points in time. This also is related to the life cycle of a family, and there are several transition points where families may be vulnerable and in need of extra intervention. An example of this is when someone gets married or has a new child, or a relationship is dissolved, or there's a divorce. The stress, coping, and resilience perspective is used to understand how families manage crises. And some families are resilient and end in growth after a crisis or a stressor, while others do not adapt as well. One concept or issue that complicates stress is when stress piles up. So when there is no longer just one stressor, but multiple low grade stressors that pile up over time. A tool that social workers use to help understand where stress has piled up is with a family timeline. So, on the family timeline, a social worker can track important points in a family's history. So, a summary: families can be defined biologically, legally, or socially. There are many different family structures due to diversity, and we can understand families and social work practice with families through the 6 different perspectives that we just reviewed.